Haven't done that before. Hi, good evening. Now here. I'm Neil Lixman, who with my wife Pat have been members here for 27 years. First of all, thank you for attending here or virtually the first DuPage Unitarian Universalist formal presentation of leading Unitarian Universalist thinkers, kicking off what we call, thanks to the combined work of our Reverend Mandy Huizinga and our Director of Membership and Engagement, Tina Lewis, Forging Futures, Ministerial Formation Today, and our UU Future. We would not be gathered here tonight were it not for Reverend Mandy greenlighting this idea of a speaker series, which we intend to have here 2 or 3 times a year, we hope, and for the support from Tina Lewis, who embraced this idea consistent with her goal of deepening the grounding of our membership in Unitarian Universalism, plus the support of our Director of Religious Education, Steve Cooper, who oversees adult enrichment, plus the team upstairs and in the back in charge of audiovisual, Justin Hobbs and his team. Thank you to all of you. I cannot think of a better way to launch the idea of a speaker's series about possible futures for Unitarian Universalism than launching it with speakers from the Meadville-Lombard Theological School, which prepares its students to become UU ministers in an evolving non-dogmatic religion. So, tonight we will be enriched by 3 guests from Meadville-Lombard Theological School. In order of their presentations, we have first, the President of Meadville-Lombard and Professor of Religion, Ethics, and Leadership, Elias Ortega. Second, Professor of Theology, Ethics, and Philosophy of Religion, Dr. Michael Hogue. And third, the Vice President for Academic and Student Affairs, Associate Professor of Constructive Theology, the Reverend Dr. Pamela Lightsey. If time permits at the end, we will do some Q&A. We welcome all 3 of our guests. Thank you. And now I invite Dr. Elias Ortega to our pulpit.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It is such a good pleasure to be here with you. And thank you, Neil, for the invitation and your kindness and hospitality. And thank you for everyone, Reverend Mandy and others who took up their time to make this event possible. In my presentation, it's not so much a presentation, but in some ways it's setting up a little bit of the context of the work that we do at Meadville, and also sharing some words of introduction of our guests. So I have the easy part. So I'm imagining that the questions that I will answer will be the easiest if there's any questions coming my way. So at Meadville-Lombard Theological School, I think you should know that we have been in the work of preparing ministers and other religious professionals for close to 180 years. And for me, it is in the spirit that we gather in learning and partnership that I wish to invite you to come alongside us this evening in this transformative journey, that it is the work of nurturing leaders who are grounded in Unitarian Universalist values for the work of justice, equity, and compassion and service to the world. At Meadville-Lombard, we offer a rich tapestry of academic programs designed to prepare students for ministry and religious leadership. Our Masters of Divinity and Masters of Art in Religion are 2 of the cornerstone of our academic offerings, and they provide comprehensive and interdisciplinary study of religion. These programs are then also complemented by our Doctor of Ministry, which deepen religious leadership of those serving in both traditional and non-traditional ministerial settings. Many wonder what set us apart from other theological schools. One of the things that set us apart is our low residency model that is also multi-platform that enable us to remove intentionally barriers of access that can integrate both online learning and on-campus experiences, allowing our students then to not only be in community with one another on campus, but also learn how to be a peer, a colleague, and a minister in digital settings. In that way, we help our students and encourage the application of both theoretical knowledge into real-world context. And I think, as many of us know, after the pandemic, our world is becoming increasingly hybrid and digital, right? We work both at home and we work in offices, and we gather in many ways. So how do we learn and equip with the same wisdom and compassion the next generation of religious leaders? Our faculty also sets us apart because they bring a wealth of expertise in areas such as theology, ethics, queer ethics, leadership in religious communities, religious education, pastoral theology, liberation of thought, Unitarian Universalist history, philosophy of religion, sociology of religion, and so on and so forth. We may be a small faculty, but a faculty who's curious and who is significantly engaged in the work of bringing the academic, the ivory tower, into the world. They're not only scholars who are respected in their fields, they're also published authors who contribute significantly to the academy. But for them, for our faculty, for us, the intellectual rigor is matched by a commitment to the practical experience. As our students engage with our community and interest sites, integrating their learnings and service to society, our faculty does so as well. The student experience at Meadville-Lombard is as diverse as the communities that we serve. Many of our students are answering a call to ministry later in life. They bring a wealth of experience of their work and professional life into their studies. We also have younger folks who are learning new ways to be in community, reclaiming religious heritage and language to better serve their peers. Our communities of students and different cohorts form close-knit engagements that engage in deep reflection, in intentional reflection with one goal, to think how collectively we can serve our communities in nonprofit and congregational leadership. After their completion of their studies, our students may go to dedicate their life as chaplains, congregational ministers, and other careers. So that is to say that Meadville-Lombard is not just an academic institution. It is really a community of learning and liberation. Our work is to think collectively how we can be agents of change in our society. We stand at the forefront of theological innovation, pioneers in online learning, religious education, and racial justice commitments. We also invest in our alumni by creating the capacity to invest in their ongoing lifelong learning. What are the new skills that they may need to serve their congregations better? And for us, the vision is clear. We want to be part of creating a world where leadership in religious communities is as diverse and vibrant as the world itself. And to achieve this, we need other partners who are willing to come along to share our vision, our values, and our commitment to the power of transformative leadership. So we invite you tonight to hear what we have to talk about, what is the future of theological education in Unitarian Universalism, and also how we are invested in preparing a new generation of leaders. So now I want to introduce you to our two speakers, my colleague, Dr. Hogue. He is known as a preacher's kid who is married to a social worker and a father of three. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 2005 and has served on Meadville-Lombard faculty since then. He's influenced by pragmatist, process, and naturalist lineage in American philosophy of religion, which he refers to as the left wing of American radical theology. He teaches and writes at the intersection of theology, ethics, politics, and philosophy. His courses at Meadville then includes, among others, Constructive Theology, Process and Liberation Theologies, Eco-Theology, Global Religions, and Religious Naturalism. He has received awards and grants from the Templeton Foundation, the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation, the Association of Theological School, most recently the Wabash Center, and the Institute for Jewish and Christian Studies. He's author of a number of books. Some of them are Outside, The Tango Bank, Towards an Ecology of Ethics and Responsible Participation, The Promise of Religious Naturalism, one of my favorites, and American Immanence, Democracy for an Uncertain World. And Dr. Pamela Lightsey has been a cutting-edge church in the church and in the academy as a leader in multiple ways. She is currently the Vice President for Academic and Students Affairs at Meadville-Lombard Theological School, and also Associate Professor of Constructive Theology. She continues to serve in this capacity while also ministering in the church, in the urban village. Following service in the U.S. Army and work as a civil servant, Dr. Lightsey received her academic and theological training at Columbus State University, Gammon Seminary of the Interdenominational Theological Center, and Garrett Evangelical Theological School, where she received her PhD. After ordination, she served as the first as a United Methodist Congregational pastor, and then as a theological school educator, scholar, and administrator. Her life has been dedicated to leading as a social justice activist, teacher, and recognized for her work, among many other things, causes supporting peacemaking, racial justice, and LGBTQI rights. One of her books, Our Life Matters, A Woman in Queer Theology, is here also, so you can see it. She can speak more to that work, and I know that she is currently working in another full manuscript that we're waiting their arrival in the world. And she's also an excellent, excellent preacher. So thank you, colleagues, and thank you for your time and your hospitality tonight. Dr. Hogue.
Well, thank you, Neil and Pat, for your hospitality, Reverend Mandy for your ministry and for welcoming us here, and Drs. Ortega and Lightsey for your friendship and your leadership at Meadville. And to all of you for being here. It's good to see some familiar faces, students and former students, and who knows, maybe future students. We'll see. So I'm going to explain how I've structured my comments. I've divided this into two basic parts. The prompt that I was given was, how should UU theologies change to meet the challenges of the contemporary world? So I'm first of all going to talk about how I understand theology, because there's a lot in that question that's predicated on what theology is. And then in the second part, I'll address some contemporary challenges, interpret them theologically, and suggest some shifts in UU theologies that I think we need to begin to make, and that we are making at Meadville. So first of all, what is theology? I'm going to offer a formal definition, a descriptive definition, and something that's a little more playful and memorable. We'll see. So formally, like biology is the science of life, psychology is the science of psyche or mind and personality, theology is the study of theos, logos about theos, the science of rational speaking and thinking about the divine or God. So the subject of theology is God or the gods, the sacred or holy, ultimate concern, higher powers and ideals. And we can just say then, based on this formal definition, that theology is the rational activity of religious imagination. By rational is meant disciplined intellectual reflection, and by imaginative, here I mean that the subject matter of theology, the theos in theology, is always symbolically mediated and culturally situated. So that's the formal definition by way of the structure of the word. Now, descriptively, what is it that theologians are really doing? And here's a different way to think about this. Theologians construct, deconstruct, and reconstruct religious symbols, values, and institutions. This description means that theology is inevitably contextual and constructive, even when it's presented as explicative and recuperative. To say that it's contextual is to say that it's always bound up in a historical and cultural context, that theological work is always shaped and influenced by patterns of thinking and categories and concepts and metaphors that are available in a given context. That's to say that it's contextual. That's what it means to say that it's contextual. It's always engaged with the world, then. To say that it's constructive is to say that theologians, by doing the work of theology, are contributing to the life of the symbols, the values, and the institutions that define a religious tradition. You're not simply repeating what the tradition says, right? They're actually contributing something. They're building the tradition as they do their theological work. This description of theology means that the practice of theology ensures that our religious symbols, practices, values, and institutions are never static, but are always dynamic. They're subject to continuous revision and clarification through an extended historical conversation. So that's the second way to think about theology, a description of what theologians are doing. Now here's the more playful and maybe the pithier definition, the one that I like to use especially with my students. Theology is meaning-making, truth-oriented, justice-seeking, spiritual play. Every one of those parts of that definition are important. Let me explain why. Theology needs to be meaning-making because the meaning of our human experience in the world is ambiguous. It's open to interpretation. The meaning of our experience isn't transparent, and it isn't given. It's something that we make as we go along through our lives in the world, with others and in communities. So it's meaning-making. But it also needs to be truth-oriented. And this is because what's going on in the world is about more than our individual experience of it. And it's also because some interpretations of what's going on in the world are more adequate than others. Meaning-making that isn't concerned with truth leads us to the world of alternate facts, conspiracy theories, and January 6th. But theology is also justice-seeking, because the point of theology is not just to interpret the world meaningfully or describe it truthfully, but to change it, to make it more fair, to make it more equitable, to liberate people, right? So there's a practical application that drives theological work, changing the world. So theology needs to be justice-seeking. But theology is also, and this is really important, I think, a type of spiritual play. Everything I've said sounds a little maybe intellectual and conceptual and abstract, but really when it comes down to it, all of that is a type of spiritual play. And this is what distinguishes theology from, for example, philosophy or ethics or theory. Theologians make meaning, seek the truth, and pursue justice through reflection on experiences, texts, institutions, and rituals that are concerned with the holy. The sublime mysteries of life and the universe, which both terrify us and fascinate us, are the spiritually playful subject matter of theology. So that's the first part of the talk. This is what I mean by theology. This is how we talk about theology and do theology at Meadville-Lombard. Let me summarize it before moving on. And this is also important to say. A theology is not something that one has. It's not an intellectual possession or a territory of belief that needs to be enclosed and defended. Instead, it's a critical activity of religious imagination, undertaken by and within religious communities. It's not a solo, but a communal enterprise. It's something that we do together. And why do communities take up this critical work of religious imagination? They do so because neither they nor their religious symbols and values exist in an historical and cultural vacuum. Life in our world provokes unending questions and challenges to which religious people are compelled to respond. For religious people, the complexity and importance of life's questions and challenges are illuminated through their religious symbols and values. This is not to say that religious symbols and values are the exclusive explanatory key to the world, but it is to say that they are a prism that enables us to see aspects of life and engage dimensions of the world that we might not otherwise be able to see or engage. So theology is the name for the reflective and critical activity religious communities undertake as they bring their religious imagination to bear in the human quest to understand themselves and their worlds more fully. Now, the second part of the prompt: what sorts of contemporary challenges does UU theology need to respond to, and maybe what kinds of changes in UU theology might engaging these challenges lead to? So let's use a theological prism now to interpret and respond to some of our contemporary challenges. I'm going to focus on two, right? I mean, there's so many we could choose from. I'm going to focus on two big ones: planetary and political. What can a theological prism illuminate about these challenges? And what needed changes to UU theologies are made visible by these illuminations? After 19 years of teaching Unitarian Universalist ministry students, I'm happy to say that all of them are morally concerned about the state of the planetary environment. And in more recent years, especially since the 2016 election, all of our students are concerned with the state of democracy. I'm also glad to say that most of the students have critical analyses of the social, economic, and ideological drivers of both the political and the planetary crises. However, as important as such analyses are, on their own, they tend to abstract and externalize the problem. The emphasis on the critique of systems makes it easier for UUs to conceal the reality of our own human hubris and our complicity in the problems we face. So in light of this, I'm going to say up front what I'm going to take another few minutes to say at length. Here's the critical point I want to make. The ecological crisis is the outcome of a human species exceptionalism through which we exempt ourselves from the ecological limits that human and other life depend upon. This species exceptionalism is a larger instance of a UU moral exceptionalism that prevents UU theologies from developing more sustainable institutions and sustaining more effective social engagements. That's the critical point I want to make in sum. So I'm going to start by offering a theological critique of the planetary crisis, and then move to the political, and then into the discussion about what needs to change. Our planetary eco-crisis shows that we have made the Earth over in our human image. There's no place on Earth that doesn't reflect our species' self-image, and no place on Earth unhaunted by the idols of human power and desire. Aside from technical and scientific questions about the future habitability of the planet for human and other life, and aside from the moral and political questions about effects and causes, for example, that those who have contributed the least are the most negatively affected, those who had contributed the most are the least negatively affected. Aside from those important questions, our planetary emergency mirrors back to us a spiritually calamitous species narcissism. Everywhere we look, we see ourselves. We have terraformed the planet in our image. We have remade the earth homo imago, in the human image. So viewed through a theological prism of respect for the interdependent web of existence, the state of the planet reveals our species' exceptionalism. Through our arrogance, greed, and self-centered disregard for other lives and for the future, we have made ourselves into creator gods, exempt from the conditions of ordinary creatural life. Now, a theological take on our political crisis. It should be deeply disturbing to a tradition that is committed to democratic process as a religious or spiritual value, that democracy here in the US and around the world is under assault. White Christian nationalists, right-wing populists, and authoritarians have not only eviscerated democratic norms, degraded the media, demonized immigrants, attacked reproductive justice, fueled a spike in hate crimes, and flouted the rule of law. They have also cannibalized one of our two major political parties and left intellectually honest political conservatives without a political home. Theologically considered, the far-right fusion of Christian and white supremacy has transubstantiated a bigoted body politic into a parody of the body of God and transformed a narcissistic sociopath into the Messiah. In short, the American far right has become a theopolitical cult of personality. To defeat this anti-democratic bigotry, something more substantive is needed than a denominational commitment to democratic process or efforts to get out the vote, as important as both of those things are. So that's the theological take on two big contemporary challenges. Now, what and how should UU theologies change to address these challenges more adequately? UU theologies need to learn to address the spiritual and moral dimensions of the planetary and the political challenges, as well as addressing their ideological and systemic aspects. And to do this, UUs need to challenge our tendencies toward moral exceptionalism, by which I mean the tendency among many of us to conflate a right analysis of what's wrong with the world with the general assumption that we, as a denomination and as individual UUs, are or should be immune from moral error. Getting over this moral exceptionalism is important for at least three reasons. One, it's important for our self-understanding. We're not always right. We do not know everything we need to know. Secondly, it's essential to counteracting the perfectionism that derails many ministers and congregations. And third, it's necessary to sustain our social engagements over the long haul rather than succumb to despair when things get tough. The theological correction to Unitarian Universalist moral exceptionalism is to develop a more theologically radical account of the human condition. Such a theology is foundational to an ethics of inclusion and generosity and a spirituality of imperfection. Let me elaborate a bit. UU theologies generally have what is considered a high anthropology and a low sociology. This means that UU theologies generally assume that humans, maybe especially UU humans, are good and society is bad. As a result, UU theologies tend to be oriented around social analyses of power. This is an honorable theological trademark of UU theologies. There are a lot of theologies out there that do not engage questions of power or analyze social systems and ideology. UU theologies do that, and they do that well. And this is important because the critical analysis of power, how and why it's uneven, how it's ideologically sustained and concealed, who embodies it, how institutions consolidate and enclose it. These questions are indispensable to helping us to resist systems of exploitation and oppression and to build a more just, equitable, and sustainable world. And yet, However necessary analyses of power may be, they are insufficient to the challenges we face, planetary, political, and otherwise. In addition to theories of power, we need theologies that are complex enough to recognize and respond to fundamental, species-typical human tendencies to self-centeredness, greed, and arrogance. In other words, we need to challenge our moral exceptionalism by deflating our anthropology. Several things tend to happen when our anthropology is too high, or when our theologies don't adequately attend to the moral ambiguity of our human condition, or when we are not sufficiently suspicious of ourselves theologically. First, if we assume too much of ourselves morally, we're likely to replicate injustice in our efforts to create justice. Second, we will be surprised when the good we seek to realize doesn't come about, and this surprise easily leads to despair, as I mentioned earlier. And third, we will tend to externalize blame, because we tend to assume that we are in the moral right. When something goes wrong, it's either some other person or group's fault, or it's the fault of the system. So our theologies need to do more than theorize power and analyze social systems. Because our planetary and political challenges are problems of systems and power, it is also true that they are human problems with spiritual roots. And until we develop theologies capable of acknowledging that fact, the systems and powers that drive the planetary and political crises will continue to prey upon and divide us. But where does this UU moral exceptionalism come from? By and large, it's a reaction to historically weaponized accounts of human sin. So what I'm talking about is sin. I'm talking about human sin. But this moral exceptionalism in Unitarian is a reaction to weaponized accounts of human sin. And to counter those weaponized accounts of human sin, we affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And this is good, and this is right, and this is true. But too often, the affirmation of inherent worth has prevented us from developing theologies capable of addressing our own fundamental hubris, greed, and arrogance. And since it's through hubris, greed, and arrogance that we have remade the world in our human image and brought the planet to the brink of ecological collapse, UU's committed to the interdependent web of existence should also be committed to developing theologically realistic accounts of our human condition. Furthermore, a critique of moral exceptionalism is foundational to our UU commitment to the spiritual value of democracy. Such an exceptionalism prevents us from checking our own tendencies toward ideological homophily. Our tendency, in other words, only to welcome those who think exactly like us and to shun all others. This exclusivity conflicts with our democratic commitment on two levels. It conflicts with the spirit of empathy and mutual regard and respect that democracy depends upon. And it keeps us from building broader social and political coalitions. So the liberal high anthropology of onward and upward forever is historically wrong, it's existentially disingenuous, it's politically self-defeating, and it's ecologically negligent. Although we rightly affirm that all persons have inherent worth and dignity, this does not mean that we are all invariably good. We are fundamentally ambiguous. For the sake of the planet and our politics, we need theologies that can help us to recognize that and to grow through it. Such a theology is foundational to an ethics of care and generosity and radical inclusion. And such an ethics can give shape to spiritual practices of imperfection that can help us forgive ourselves and build more resilient ministries, more inclusive congregations, and more sustainable social engagements. Thank you.
I want to thank my colleagues for what they have presented and for setting me up as they have. Or perhaps I should not thank them, because I find myself in a precarious position. I want to thank also Neil, Pat, Reverend Mandy, President Ortega, and also Michelle Novak, who is here with us. Wave your hand, Michelle, from Meadville-Lombard Theological School, and the many faculty and staff and the work that they and our students and our Board of Trustees do to make us the very fine school that we are. In my tradition, we talk about standing on the shoulders of the ancestors and those who go before us. I will say that we can do none of the work that you see represented here tonight without all of those persons that I've just pointed out for you. I've been asked in this second part to touch upon how our curriculum contributes to prepare ministers who are ready to serve in an evolving religious environment. And I'm so thankful, Mike, that you really clarified for us theology. I want to begin by prefacing what I say by telling you that I truly believe in a seminary training. I believe that seminary training is critical, not only for our churches, but that seminary training is critical for our world. I really believe that. I believe in the value of an education, not simply because an education was denied so many of my ancestors, but because I see the challenges of the lack of an education and the challenges of anti-intellectualism that is really propelling our nation and dare I say our world into some very, very serious and critical moments in history. So I believe in the value of a seminary education. I believe seminary training helps to prepare some of the major leaders of our world. Here we are today on April the 4th, 2024, and at the beginning of the day, I began by remembering that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in the year 1968, and he was a man who valued theological education, and he used his theological education to help lead our country and our world into what he thought would be the building blocks of a beloved community. So that's my preface. If I'm to stand here and toot my horn about a theological education, it is because I have seen the value of it time and time again in the leaders, the remarkable leaders that we give tribute to in our society. And the converse is true, that the lack of a seminary education has led to some fanaticism, some very dangerous fanaticism in our world, has led to what we now hear being spoken about as white Christian evangelicalism that is not only part of the American landscape, but as Mike has tried to outline, part of the landscape of our world. So I'm thankful to be able to come and talk to you all about the value of curriculum, and I want to also say co-curriculum, and how it will help prepare ministers. So let me begin by saying that I am one who, I just believe in the value of the mind, preparing the mind. How many of you watched The Matrix? Oh, yeah. Have seen The Color Purple? Yeah. Or have seen the new movie Oppenheimer? Eh? Well, my children don't like to go to the movies with me. And they don't like to go to the movies with me so much, and maybe some of you, because it's difficult for me to sit through a movie without this, the analysis going on in my brain. Like, why are they doing this? Like, oh, I see the theology in this. Can you all go to the movies and see the symbolism? And it's like the dendrites in your mind are just popping off, and you're having all these conversations and these subtexts going on in your brain. That's what theologians do. You are a theologian. Now, we will ask the question about what kind of theologian you are later on. But the value of a theological education helps us to address not only the abstract things in life, but also the very practical things, even things that are so very esoteric that it might miss your friends, or it might go above the heads of those in your life who you think are dear. So a theological education is important. I don't need to linger on that too much. But let me talk for a few minutes about curriculum. What goes into making the sausage of curriculum? And what goes into making the sausage of curriculum at Meadville-Lombard Theological School is a number of things. First of all, our curriculum is designed so that Unitarian Universalist students have the bulk of what they need for credentialing at the point at which they're ready to graduate. Now, what is it that you hope that a minister will have when they enter into your faith community? I would hope that you would value a minister who values diversity of thought, theologically, philosophically, politically, and also socioeconomic diversity of thought. That you would also value a minister who understands what is in fact meant by ministry. Unfortunately, many people only understand ministry in terms of preaching or in terms of parish ministry. At Meadville-Lombard, we prepare people when it comes to our curriculum to do ministry in multiple ways. Ministry not only happens within the church or the sanctuary, but ministry, as we understand it, happens in not-for-profit institutions. Ministry happens in communities. Ministries happens in corporate America. If you don't think so, ask some CEOs who really value people who are able to speak about spirituality, what it means to be human, and who walk into their offices and have wonderful, rich conversations with them that help them to make it Monday through Friday, not just a data bank. Also, we try to develop curriculum that helps students, that helps persons who are coming through our doors, not just our students, but our staff sometimes listen to lectures. Our alums listen to lectures. But we try to develop curriculum and co-curriculum that is curious about religion. What is religion? That is curious about faith. What do we mean when we say faith? That is curious about spirituality. And there are many studies that are going on about spirituality and what it means to be spiritual, what it means to be a nun, a not religious person, what it means also when we talk about humanism. So we're hoping that that our students will value will value a curriculum that attends to those things, but also that our students will value the capacity to blend the sacred and the secular. That is to say that what happens, that the mind is not left when one enters a church, but you're very much involved in the practice of critical thinking, even as you listen to a lecture, and also that you value the process of thinking, that you value the mind outside of a church, the sacred and the secular. In my tradition, we say that there is no division between the sacred and the secular. And that also our curriculum is attentive to not only the life of the mind, but the importance of the heart. Because it's one thing to be able to think critically, it's another thing to be able to put all of that into practice when you're on the streets and engaged in some sort of activism. How do you engage the heart? How do you engage the mind when you're on the streets outside of the church, outside of your community, and with people who may not think about spirituality like you? And with people who may not think about faith like as you do. How do you blend all that together to help make the world a better place? So our curriculum tries to get at that in terms of preparing people for ministry, in what is traditionally understood as ministry, and also in the pathways of what is considered as ministry in non-traditional ways. So what also goes into developing the sausage of curriculum? Our faculty get together when we're thinking about courses, and we not only think about courses that are important for credentialing, but we think about courses that value self-interrogation that will reflect upon the call. We ask plenty of questions about the call. But the questions about the call are an attempt to get at several things. One, what motivates you to do the work of ministry? What is motivating you to do the work of ministry? Are you considering entering into ministry because you're a do-gooder? Are you thinking about doing ministry because you really like standing behind the mic? And you spend more time behind the microphone than people really want you to do? Might not be the ministry that you need to do. And also, what motivates you? Consider, where should ministry take place for you? We try to attend to that in our curriculum. Is ministry in a parish, in a church, a good fit for you in terms of your call? In terms of how you see yourself, helping to build that beloved community that King was trying to get at. All of this is helping, we believe, an attempt to help students think about, and our faculty think about, and you who are parishioners who will receive those who will become ministers in whatever capacity, think about, am I fit? Ask themselves, am I fit for ministry? Or is this about self-aggrandizement? Now, at Meadville-Lombard, we faculty also ask that question, is the student fit for ministry? And I know that those who are mentoring our students in their internship are also asking that question, is this person fit for ministry? So what am I getting at? The fitness for ministry is not dependent upon seminary alone. So I want to disabuse you of that. Very often people will say, well, you sent so-and-so to us, and you really didn't do a good job of preparing them for ministry. Well, the curriculum can only do so much, my friends. This is an effort that will take all of us. That will take all of us. It will really take many of you, because to sit someone down and say, you know what? you went off on so-and-so about the color of the carpet. Maybe ministry is not the right place for you. So we try to get at some of these practical questions. We look at our curriculum for the sake of diversity. We as faculty ask ourselves, who are the scholars that we're asking our students to engage with? We want the scholarship to be scholarship that's contemporary in terms of time. We hope there are some classics that we want our students to wrestle with because the classics are very, very good, but we also want to make sure that our students are hearing and reading from sources from diverse scholars from diverse contexts, because the world in which they will go out into is a world that is quite diverse. And so we want to make sure that they have that experience of being confronted with diverse scholarship and to wrestle with scholarship that challenges their theological thinking, to wrestle with scholarship that may be different than what they learned in their churches, and to really deconstruct from time to time what they thought of theology or how they thought the world should be or what they thought of religion. Curriculum and good curriculum and good seminary training is there to help you to wrestle with your preconceived understanding of the world and of theology and of religion and of faith. I don't think that we are doing our job as scholars if we don't push your button. If you come comfortable and you leave comfortable. Those of you who've gone to seminary, who've had some seminary courses, will understand how uncomfortable a theological education will be to you. But it's better that you're uncomfortable, as I tell my students. It's better that you're uncomfortable in this room than you go out of seminary and you put yourself in a very dangerous situation. Let me move on. So it's the value of self-interrogation. And then what seminary does, Dr. Hogue talked about basically the big lie and what's going on politically in our world. Our curriculum is really put in place to value research. Now let me just say what I mean by this. I do not mean Wikipedia as research. I do not mean what I hear many people saying when they say, well, you know, I did my research. What we do in seminary is we help persons to value what we call primary source material. Now, many of you have looked on social media and seen things go viral that was pure trash. It was not true. Somebody passed it on to somebody else passed it on. It had millions of views, but it was not right to begin with. And people have been harmed by many viral posts that did not start out with primary source material. We teach our students in the classroom the value of primary source material. So if you have a student who comes back to you and they're upset because they did not get the best grade that they thought they could get, and you ask them to show you the paper and there's not one citation on the paper, your question to them was, so you submitted a paper that was full of original thought, and you're the first person to ever think of these ideas. This is where we need your help, eh? Because we hope that we teach our students the value of primary source material in an era of rising propaganda. In an era of the big lie. How do you go back to determine where this came from? Who said this? Why did they say this? And not be dependent upon the headline alone. We do our work well, we will teach students to understand that. Now, we also value practical education. So part of our work of preparing ministers to serve in an evolving religious environment is to ensure that they get some internship, some practical, some hands-on training. And you could be very helpful for us here as a congregation, as are many Unitarian Universalist congregations that allow students to come in and have that practical experience as an intern site. Nothing can replace that when it comes to preparing ministers. It is not that you're in charge of the student, but that you see yourselves as a congregation, that internship, the opportunity for internship, the opportunity for hands-on preparation is the opportunity for someone to wrestle in real time with the experiences that will come to a clergy person. It's very important. And then I'm just going to say a few words, and then I'm going to finish. I'm going to talk about co-curricular opportunities. We talk about preparing ministers as though sometimes we do, as though it only happens for 3, maybe 5-year period of time. But the preparation for ministry is ongoing. If we do this right, we will teach people to value reading. Books will be their best friend. Journals will become almost their best friends. They will read newspapers. They will have a rich appetite for reading. They will have a rich appetite for doing what you all are doing here tonight, and that's coming to hear what others are saying, to be engaged in the thinking process. And we do that through lifelong learning opportunities at Meadville-Lombard Theological Schools. Right now, we have a program where we're training folk and they're receiving a certificate in spiritual direction. I will say to you, as an activist who has been on the streets in many, many protests since the Black Power movement, I'm a child of the Black Power movement, I can tell you that there's probably not many more valuable trainings than to teach people to be spiritual directors, to help people connect with self-care, what it means to think about the spirit, what it means to think outside of yourself. So that's one of our certificates in lifelong learning. We're dealing with a number of things in lifelong learning. President Ortega and I, we spoke to our director of lifelong learning today, and we're really excited about the direction that lifelong learning will take. I will speak about our degrees very briefly now. We have, as you know, it's been considered the top degree for someone considering parish ministry, and that's the Masters of Divinity. That's a 3-year credit-bearing program that people who are contemplating some form of ministry, church, community, or not-for-profit ministry, will come and receive a degree in this area. The other degree, which I'm very proud of, Dr. Mike Hogue and I, we reshaped this degree. This is the Master of Arts in Religion. This is a 2-year degree. It's a very rigorous degree. So we do not encourage people who are not really wanting to do a deep dive and to do some serious, some very, very challenging reading that would ultimately prepare them for a PhD program. And I'm very pleased, and I want to report to you that two of our most recent students in this program that we just revitalized have been approved for PhD studies with full scholarships. That's what Meadville-Lombard is doing, and I'm very proud of it. It's not easy, because Dr. Hogue and myself, we're not that easy to get along with in the classroom. But when you finish, you'll be prepared for a doctoral program, and these are good schools. The third degree that we offer is a Doctor of Ministry. Now, we know for many years Meadville had a DMin program. It closed its DMin program. That is now open. So we're hoping to begin to attract DMin students are persons who are interested in the doctor of ministry from around the nation, and we hope that you will point people who are clergy to Meadville to enroll in our Doctor of Ministry program. And then finally, we have a Certificate of Theological Studies. And this Certificate of Theological Studies is a curriculum for people who may or may not be interested in a degree. It is the beginning. It is what you can say it's kind of like a launch pad into a full degree program that you're not quite sure of. It's only a 12-credit program, but one can take it and concentrate in either theology, history, faith formation, or pastoral care. We're very proud of these degrees. We're very proud of our revised curriculum. It took us a year to revise the curriculum, and it's doing quite splendidly. These are the things that I'm quite proud of, and these are the reasons that I really, really hope that you will think about Meadville as you think about students in theological education or yourself. I'll stop, and I think we're at a point to receive questions.
You want to take it? Okay, so we have an open mic, and we encourage anyone who wants to come up. We talked about going from, 7 p.m. to 8:30. We still have 25 minutes. So come on up if you'd like to ask anyone a question. Thank you.
First of all, thank you. Excellent presentations, and I resonated with a lot of the things that you were saying. And one of the ideas that I had too is I've often thought of religion and attachment to theology is at its best a transforming thing for each one of us. And at its worst, it's used to justify our rather darker inclinations, and I see a lot of that. And a little bit related to that is my question, which is, and I think I heard you say this, which is very reassuring, right, about preparing ministers. All of us have our own mental models and constructs, and theological and other. And, but not all of us have a humility about those, in the sense that we, and you brought up examples of that, including, looking at things in terms of power and how it's used, which is a hugely useful and important way, but it's a construct nonetheless. And I think we fall in love with some of these metaphors and constructs. So my question really is, in your training, do you really, really push your students to understand that their constructs, their metaphors are not necessarily true, and they need to really revisit those and say, this is useful, but I find it useful because it fits with my experience, and to try to situate that in a more humble way with their experience as opposed to this is true. So, thank you.
I'm sure we all could respond to that. I'll go ahead and just say briefly that yes, we do that. We do that in lots of different ways. We do that when it comes to students who have pre-existing theological ideas that we want them to begin to. Dr. Lightsey was talking about self-interrogation. So that self-interrogative work is often about the constructs and the metaphors and the stories that are in our students' heads that they've often taken to be fixed and kind of a true account of the way things are. So part of the self-interrogation is about loosening that up. One of the things that I like to say, a lot of students and a lot of folks are rightly concerned with the way we use language and what language, how language can be violent and oppressive. I like to say, let's not eliminate metaphors, but let's multiply them so that we're not fixed on any one set of them.
Pass the mic. So I really appreciate your question, because your question had me thinking about the ways that people enter the classroom and the ways that people leave the classroom. But what is most important for me as a faculty person is the engagement that happens while we're in there together. And that is those are very personal moments for our students. So the ways that we help detangle some of what you're talking about is helping students to see themselves as part of a bigger community and to be part of a bigger community of humanity, is to wrestle not only in terms of self-interrogation, but to also think about human beings as complex. And we come with major contradictions. And the classroom helps us to see over the course of a semester our own contradictions within our own selves. So for instance, it's one thing to begin class very self-righteously. It's another thing in the middle of the class to talk about, well, you know, I like videos that are a little bit ratchet. You know, to admit that part of the human being, and to unpack that theologically, and to talk about perfection, to talk about imperfection, to talk about hubris, as Mike has talked about hubris, and I write about hubris, and he and I, we kind of differ on hubris. But in the classroom where when we're talking together, that engagement is so very powerful that it in and of itself is a learning.
Yeah, I think that what I would add to that is that in my teaching, I like to help our folks think through developing a robust toolkit and a rich tools within their theological thinking and thoughts that they can mobilize in particular situations, right, for particular outcomes. And what I think that oftentimes have lead to help is for folks to understand that their own mental models are flexible and evolved, that mental models can be used at times with strategy, right? At times they can be used for domination, right, and control, depending how they're used. They can also be used with care and for caring for others, but being able to understand when to mobilize a particular model, how and why is also part of the way in which folks in ministerial reflection can develop, right? So part of that construction and deconstruction requires a reconstruction as well. So when you reconstruct, right, you're not necessarily throwing away everything that you have learned and that you destroyed, right? But there are things that get salvaged, right, and repurposed, right, again.
Yes, I'll echo my thanks and admiration. What a great hour. It was wonderful. I'm a real fan of etymology. So when I heard the definition of theology, oh, there's theo and there's logy, and you put it together, I was on the bus right away. I was there, yep. And I got the logic part and the analysis, and then we went to the theo part, and I knew that had something to do with God and higher power. Where I got confused was when you broke that into the three parts, and you said one of them was justice. Now, I also have a bad habit of when I hear speakers and I'm engaged, running ahead and filling in the blank for you. What that ought to mean, because we learned in this room not too long ago from one of our guest ministers, was Unitarian Universalism had the two parts. Okay, the Unitarian is there's one God, and the Universalism was that it's a God of love. Okay, nobody goes to hell, etc., etc. I was waiting to hear, well, it's justice because we have this loving God. Okay, I didn't hear that, that's okay. It was my story, not yours. But what I really need to understand, because why is it that you have to study the God part and the higher power why does justice have to be part of it? Because to me, justice is subjective. What the heck is justice anyway? And I know I might sound heretical to say that, but in an objective analysis of a higher power, I'm just wondering, why is justice a major component? And I guess I need a little elaboration on that.
I'll offer a quick thought on that. So when I offered the formal, the descriptive, and then the pithy, playful definitions, I wasn't suggesting that these are equivalent. I was saying here's 3 different ways to think about it. And the formal, the etymological was one way to begin to introduce this idea to students and to folks that haven't heard about or don't know what theology is in basic terms. To me, the justice part is important in the definition and the way we do theology at Meadville specifically, and in the liberal theological tradition, because it's so much about, the way this is sometimes talked about is orthopraxy rather than orthodoxy, so rather than right belief, kind of right action or practice in the world. To me, no theology will be adequate to a religious tradition or to the world or to human experience if it doesn't have a kind of ethical application. And I agree that justice is one of these kind of words that can be defined and disputed and debated. There's no exhaustively right definition of it, but all I mean to signal by saying that theology is meaning-making, truth-oriented, justice-seeking spiritual place, that it has that moral, that ethical drive in it. It's about an application to life. If theology is only reflection on God, then it's a much more philosophical type of theology. But even most philosophical theologies and systematic theologies have an ethical aspect to them. So the justice seeking is just meant to signal that that's a dimension of theological work that is important to me and to us at Meadville.
I want to give you an example. I was in Ferguson the first 21 days of unrest. And those are very critical days. This is when a lot of the tear gas, pepper spray, all of that was being hurled at the protesters. I was there during those first 21 days and actually ended up going back and forth I was at Boston University at the time, for over a year period of time. And initially when I went as a constructive theologian with one question. And that question was, what is justice? That's a very valuable question. And it's really valuable when you don't think you've gotten it. And so I asked that question on the streets in Ferguson. And I have it on video. I videoed live streams quite often during those days. And one woman said to me, when I asked that question, her response was very theological, and you could not have convinced her that she was speaking theology. She said, I said, what is justice? And she said, oh my God, if we don't get justice, I don't know what'll happen here. That was one of the most theological responses that I got, because she could not necessarily put her finger and clarify exactly what theology was, but she knew it had something to do with getting what was right for that community in that moment. And I went about the city asking that same question. I even asked a group of police officers and their wives and their friends at an Irish pub, what is justice? I had a lot of balls. I went there with an Angela Davis t-shirt on. Well, to tell the truth, I turned it back inside out because my aunt insisted, no black girl, you are not going into that bar with an Angela Davis afro like you're still a Black Power child. But justice is important. And your question provokes me to say that it's important theologically whether or not you believe in God. You do believe in, the idea of love is the ultimate aim that I think most religious and faith traditions have when they speak about the divine or something that's outside of ourselves, that's mystical, that we cannot put our fingers on. I hope that's all I got for you.
Thank you.
I'm cognizant of the fact that we're in a church that's liberal theology based, and that you all have that background too. And it seems like so many of the definitions that you brought up and the topics that you came fit right in our comfort zone. They're in our swing zone. We can hit those softballs for a mile. But I'm wondering about, with the definitions of theology and justice and all these, so much of friends I've known that have gone through seminaries and so on, it almost seems like, how much are we just talking to ourselves, and how much does this really mean to other religious histories, religious people that have their own definition of theology and so on? I question how much pushback we'd get in a different setting than this. And how much is this just all fitting in, and it's all comfortable, it's sitting very nicely here with us right now. But is this the real world? Is this the world bigger than us?
I've got a quick go. Are you ready? So I actually thought that by bringing sin into this conversation that I was going to be bringing in an uncomfortable topic. So I mean, I described theology, and it may be that, the way I described theology or defined it in these three ways is not the way somebody at a conservative evangelical seminary would define it. I would argue that's what they're doing, even if they wouldn't define it that way. But the real substance of what I was trying to say is that liberal, progressive, Unitarian Universalist leaders and congregations need to deflate our anthropology, which means essentially you regain a sense of human fallibility. Sin is the symbol for what I was talking about, right? And the reason I'm saying that is because I think absent that, we're just a zealous social justice sect. And that's alienating to a lot of people. I think it's a kind of, I think it's self-defeating in terms of bridging across religious and other theological differences. So, Meadville and UU Theologies have done a very good job with social analysis, social ethics, all the power and identity questions. I thought I was going out on a limb by saying, hey, let's bring sin back into the conversation. That's what I was trying to do.
Yeah, I think in some ways, let me say that, you are a very friendly audience, right, to be able to embrace some conversation to an extent about theological discourse, right, particularly within academic context that leads to formation without having a particular charged response, right? And I can say, let me now turn that to talk about my experience, right, as a theological educator who is a UU. In one example, in 2017, Reverend Dr. Sophia Betzencourt, now the president of the UUA, then was a faculty at Star King, we made a proposal that was accepted to talk about theology in General Assembly. Right? And we have a high number of colleagues who pulled us aside telling us we were doing professional suicide, right, by bringing an open conversation about theology in General Assembly because you don't speak about theology. Right, and part of the angle, the concern is like, well, if we start talking about theology and naming what it is, then we are becoming dogmatic. We're telling people what to believe. And it's like, no, as you can hear, right, as you heard tonight, there are tools and many ways that we can think through. These are the layers and some of the complexities are thinking theologically as a strategy of how do we want to live as a community together, what is our responsibility to the planet, to one another, to democracy, provide a particular kind of direction, right, to answers to very significant questions without telling you this is the only answer. So for us, that moment was really challenging to tell our colleagues, we're still going to go through this and we're going to do it because we have heard from other colleagues, right, and parishioners, this is an important conversation. Another example, in the Commission of Institutional Change, where many of you know that I was one of the commissioners, when we did different focus groups and conversation with religious professionals and colleagues and surveys, we oftentimes ask, what are some of the things that we should include, right? And how should we frame this? What are some of the priorities? And to the top raised that we need to ground this work in our theological tradition. Now, guess which have been the chapters that we have heard the most complaint and concern about? The chapter on theology. Right, and reflecting back to this is a call from the community, right, to commissioners to center this particular kind of work, not to set a dogma, right, but to open a conversation has been tricky and very complex. And part of it is, I think, is our kind of liberal tradition reaction to being told what to believe and what to think, instead of thinking through what are the best tools available to us that we can mobilize, right, for our enrichment, for our well-being, to be able to answer these very, very critical questions, right? Theology does not have to assume a supernatural being, right? There's many very humanistic theologies as well, right? So I think that's what I'd like to offer to that.
But the capacity to speak the language of theology and to include God and sin is important for our time. And where there is a void, it will be filled. What Unitarian Universalists do in terms of being progressive, in terms of being justice-oriented, is wonderful. But you cannot allow a void to be filled in the language of theology by conservative evangelicals. And I say this as someone who grew up as a conservative evangelical Baptist Pentecostal. So I can speak that language. And it's been important to me to be able to speak that language, because when people try to insult and attack and come at my loved ones all kinds of ways, I have in my toolkit the ability to speak the language that they are familiar with. You want to quote scriptures? I can quote John 14 verse by verse, because the Pentecostal church taught me that. I understand the text. Conversely, I know how to preach a sermon without even opening up the Hebrew Bible or the New Covenant. I could preach a sermon using James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Edgar Allan Poe. I can Shakespeare. I have preached eulogies using Shakespeare.
Robert Ingersoll?
Not so much. but I'm talking
My
about
hero?
but I'm talking about the ability to have a rich toolkit, and not just to give away, to give this landscape of theology over to the evangelicals because we don't want to speak about God, or we don't want to speak about sin. I look at Fox, and I'm not so much, I used to look at Glenn Beck all the time, but I look at it so that I can understand it, so that I can have a conversation about things that matter to my community, that matter to my students. So it's not just swimming in the waters that I want to swim in.
Okay.
Sometimes I got to go to the muddy lakes.
Yeah.
And swim there.
I've heard the clergy project is discussed. I just want to take a second, but the clergy project, you and I have talked about it, Elias. And it's a means of many clergy, evangelical clergy, can't actually fit into their own congregations anymore. They've lost their faith, but they're captured in what's going on because of insurance needs and making a living and so on. And I'm wondering if you people would reach out to unfaithed clergy members in the South. There's a big thing going on with, there's resources set up to try to get them other jobs or other ways, and I think that getting them into Meadville-Lombard would help them share their faith, share their capacity, their skills as clergy.
I try to do that. I'm an ordained United Methodist clergy person, and my church is going through schism. I would love to have some of them come who've not been, some of the members come to Meadville also. So, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, thank you again for your wonderful talks. My question, I'll keep it short. So we're talking about the moral exceptionalism or perhaps even moral elitism that we sometimes find in UU spaces. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on, speaking of deconstruction, which is difficult work and ego breaking down work that not everybody is always ready to do in every moment. How do you suggest we do that work, both within ourselves and in the wider congregations?
Well, I think we do it at Meadville in bits and pieces through the curriculum. You were in the grounding class, right? And so that's a required first-year MDiv course, and it's organized around 3 questions. Why are you here? What's wrong? What are you going to do about it? And the first part of the class is really asking students to work backwards from the decision to come to Meadville. What is it that brought them here over time? So they're going deep into their personal story right at the beginning. And that's a part of the work of discovering the question that you are to yourself, right? The question that we are to ourselves is the work of discerning vocation, naming a calling, and figuring out how to put that into work for ministry. So that's a part of it. So it's in the curriculum. It's built into the curriculum in part. But it's also important because that is difficult work. We make a point of trying to organize the courses around dialogue groups so that students are building rapport with other students, and so they're journeying through this process together. Meadville certainly offers pastoral support for this. Out in the congregations, I think ministers are doing this continuously with pastoral care and pastoral support. I think in addition to that, some of what we're talking about needs to be named theologically from the pulpit. I think it's very hard to preach about sin and evil and human weakness and fallibility. It's just not fun stuff to talk about, but it's where every one of us is at, right? It's where every one of us is at. And so in addition to talking about it, there needs to be ritual and ritual support for that. And that's important work for ministers to develop as well.
Yeah, I just preached this Easter sermon. I'm a Christian, so we talked about sin. But I prefer to talk about social sin. And part of the deconstruction and reconstruction is not just with the student, but I think at Meadville we try to embody that as faculty, with a sense of humility, with understanding our own imperfections as faculty persons, as administrators, as trying to be as honest with students as we possibly can, and by availing ourselves to the various conversations and questions that students have. And I think that's I think that's a richness that helps students become the kind of clergy persons, the kind of leaders in our society that we all value.
I can add to that. I was raised Pentecostal, but a lot of my work as a religious educator was shaped by the Reformed tradition, and particularly the Episcopalian tradition after that. And one of the things that I became deeply aware in our UU life is we do not have ways to ritualize particular passages of life or bridges in communities, and how do we return and how do we make covenant again with the world. Right, so for example, there's nothing, those of us who grew up in traditions that were baptized, either as infants or as adults, we can relate that. We know when someone said, remember your baptism, right, we know what that means, right? But we do not have nothing like that, right, in our UU context that can bring us back into that, or something akin to the Lord's table, right, in which we come back into communion in a particular way for a particular reason. And again, I'm not calling to return to baptism, right, or to returning to the Eucharist as a practice, but there are particular rituals in communities that help you, that connects you, that inspire, that rejuvenates you, that you can own your brokenness, right, but not to let that brokenness and your sin, right, your failure defined how you're going to move out into the world again next. And I think that's part of the theological imagination that we need to reactivate, right, as a faith community. And for me, the richness of our pluralities of faith, right, and faith journeys and non-religious journeys as well, can help create something really beautiful, right, that is meaningful not only for us as a community, but for those who are coming out next.
So statistics have shown over like the last 10 years that there's been a decline in attendance in churches, denominations, and us too. And studies have shown that focusing on the children and the young adults is what is going to bring us back. And we've talked about content here tonight, content of what the ministers might be sharing in the pulpit. But I'm wondering, what is it that you do as far as teaching about how to do church? How to make it so that people want to come to the church so that they get that content and want to stay?
So part of is the internship programs. Those are part. We have a splendid course in preaching. We have courses in healthy boundaries to help clergy understand the ethical dimensions of being a clergy person, working with children and with youth. We have done some in our worship course. We've talked about the use of technology. And young adults really love technology in worship when it's used properly. So we do some of that. So we really engage some of the practical dimensions of what is formerly called liturgy. Worship is called liturgy and homiletics. So we do both of those things. We have not yet, and this is a good question that you've asked, we've not yet given as much attention in our curriculum to something like working with children, a theology that works with children. But President Ortega and I just finished an interesting grant that was given to us by the Lilly Foundation, where we looked at religious education in churches across America, with several churches, and we saw some very interesting things that were taking place that for these churches help them to have, a predominantly young adult congregation. So we hope to implement some of that in the future.
I have just something I'll say. So, yeah, faith formation classes are required at Meadville, and those aren't classes that I teach, but I believe that there's a lifespan approach to that that's attentive to childhood development and various stages of development. So that's built into the curriculum as a requirement. So I'll add that. I will say that I think that what you're putting your finger on, the importance of bringing children and youth and young adults into the churches, is a really important thing for us to be doing. One of the topics I considered taking up in my talk but didn't was the importance of becoming a more missional and evangelistic tradition, and sharing the message, right? Spreading the message. Okay, so I'm on board with that. I think it's going to become harder and harder because one of the areas I've been interested in is in accelerating social change. It's not that time is speeding up, but the world is changing at a tempo, this increasingly fast tempo. And one of the things that's doing is that it's dividing generations, more and more. If the world is changing faster and faster, then the relevant past is receding from us continuously. And that creates issues around generational relationships. And so I think it's going to, as important as it is, it's going to only get harder because the worlds that my 13-year-old lives in, are very, very different from the one that I live in. And I do my best to communicate and build a relationship, and it works out. But that's in the best of all conditions because it's a parent-child, right? So if you're an RE person in a church and you're it's just, it's a great question. It's really important. And all I can say is I think it's only going to get harder.
Yeah.
So there you go.
You know, yeah, I think I would love to say something to answer that to that question, and I need to do so with a caveat, right? And I think I want to kind of respect the boundary, right, between myself, right, and your minister, right? So I'm speaking as myself, right, as a religious educator and someone who worked and led religious education for children and youth for a number of years. And in other contexts, I've been teaching Sunday school since I was 12. And one of the things that I can say is the biggest challenge is actually the adults, right? And what happens within the context of adult worship, right? Because as I like to tell folks, oftentimes we hear that children do not want to come to church. Now, here's news. Children do not drive themselves to church, right? They may want to come and not have a way to be in church, for example. So there's something about how do we engage the adults and keep them interested, right, and committed that help that process happen. The other thing is you cannot teach a youth group how to be a church member by having them isolated in youth group from the beginning to the end, because they are not participating in the church life, right? In the imagination of the youth, then the church is my youth group, and what I do there, that is church. And once we graduate, church dissipates. They're not connected to the corporate body because we have never learned how to be together as a community. And what does that happen? Also, the comfort of the adults, right, and how they want to be in community. And I think that's something that there's many studies on this, both sociologically and theological. In some of the programs that I ran, we did some experiments on that end, and it was very successful in keeping the kids engaged. But once they started disrupting the patterns of the adults, then it became a problem that we couldn't do it. So folks were more interested in having smaller Sunday schools, right, as long as the adult worship was not disrupted in any shape or form. And I have information and data on this. So I think that's part of the question, right, for us as faith communities. How do we want to? And I would say the other area, I think, for me of growth, and Dr. Lightsey and I have had many conversations on this, also seniors, right, are an area of growth in congregations, and we tend not to prioritize also that engagement.
Okay, thank you.
Can we take one more question? Bill.
I'm the last question. In both your presentations, you mentioned humanism, and the catchphrase is good without God. If you had an absolutely sincere humanist who believed in all our Unitarian values and absolutely rejected supernatural in any form, could that person get admitted to Meadville-Lombard? Would they be comfortable going to school there, and could they graduate?
Absolutely.
I'm a theologian at Meadville, and I reject the supernatural. I'm a religious naturalist. So for me, God is a symbol for our ultimate concern. It's not a supreme supernatural being that has anthropomorphic qualities. You know, so. Oh, sorry. So the short answer to your question is yes, of course, absolutely, and probably most of our students fit that description. Not necessarily self-identified humanists, but we have very few, if any, supernatural theists, monotheists anyway. I don't know. It's not uncommon.
Actually, some examples that we can say
Say
of.
again about your personal belief. I missed it.
Just the broad category is religious naturalism. It's the idea that nature is all that there is, and nature is religiously significant.
Which is very much part of African traditional religion, you know. I am my own personal, I've already spoke about being Baptist and Pentecostal, but I'm a different kind of Christian. I'm one of these United Methodist Christians who's very much involved in interfaith traditions. And that might have to do with the fact that I lived 7 years overseas and got an opportunity to experience God in the multiplicity of ways and to understand faith coming from various and sundry aspects of life, so that I'm very comfortable in many religious and non-religious traditions, as long as we can talk about justice and liberation.
I would say we have a number of well-recognized alums in the UU world who are humanists. Reverend Kendall Gibbons, for example, David Breeden, are two who have provided leadership in the UU humanist groups for many years, and many others. At Meadville, we host the Humanist Archives that combines both AHA and UUA as a commitment, right? This is part of our tradition. So I think the answer to that is yes.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to do two thank yous. First, I want to thank our three guests tonight. It's really wonderful. And I want to thank our audience. We had no idea what our turnout would be. We thought it could be 7. I think it's roughly 60. And we don't know what our second speaker or speakers will say or be about, but it will happen because you attended tonight. Thank you very much.
And we need to give Neil a huge thank you for putting this together. Thank you, Neil. Thank you all for coming. I hope you have a great night, and hopefully it'll warm up soon so you don't have to wear